This story came from some research into the history of my family a few years ago, and I got fascinated by the life that women had during the time of my grandmother's life. And the only way I can ever think of to tell this story is in her words as she might have told it. My name is Ethelinda Patterson. I was born in Ontario, in a little town, and I lived on the edge of town on a farm with my mother and my brother John. And we had a good life there. My mother had to work every day, but we lived with an aunt and uncle, and they took care of John and me. Until one day, my mother came home from work and said, "Ethel, we are going to move. I'm going to marry my friend John, you know, Mr. Amer that comes to visit, and we're going across the St. Lawrence River, and we're going to live in the United States." Well, I thought that was wonderful. I had never been anywhere, and I had heard that people in the United States were very rich, and it was a wonderful place to live. So we started packing, and it was so exciting, but I suddenly realized my mother wasn't packing my brother's clothes, and I said, "I'll get John's clothes ready. Ethel, we're not bringing John. It'll be better if he stays here with his aunt and uncle." "But Mother," "Ethel, don't ask any questions. That's the way it's going to be." And that's the way it was. And we moved. We went across the big river, and we got to the United States, and it was fine. But I realized everybody wasn't rich, and we lived in a little house, and my mother was married to her friend John, and pretty soon they had one baby, and then they had another baby, and these little babies were sickly, and I was about 11 years old by then, so it was my job to take care of the babies. And kind of all day long, it seemed like it was always, "Ethel, do this, Ethel, do that, Ethel, the baby's crying, Ethel, you need to help get the laundry done, Ethel, it's time to do the dishes, Ethel, Ethel, Ethel." I could hardly stand it. But the thing that helped me stand it, there was one little thing. One day when we had first moved, my mother had left some papers out, and I looked down, and one of them was like one of those certificates they give you when you get baptized. And on there, it had my name, but it had Ethelinda, all together, one word. And when I looked at that, and I started saying that name, Ethelinda, Ethelinda, it sounded like music. And I would, every time I was really tired or sick of people saying, "Ethel, do this, Ethel, do that," I'd say to myself, "Ethelinda, a girl with a name like that, a girl with a name like that is bound to have some kind of a happy life." And when I was 17, I met Will. Will was so handsome. He had dark, dark hair and snapping blue eyes and a wide smile. And when he started talking or laughing, everybody just smiled and was happy. And Will loved me. And we would go for walks hand in hand, and Will would say, "Oh, Ethel, you're so beautiful. Your hair is so beautiful. I just love you, Ethel." And that was the beginning of a long Ethelinda time in my life. Will and I got married. We had 4 children. Seemed like in no time. 3 boys and a girl. And I was so happy. Life was so good. Of course, those things don't always last, and after a while, it got so Will couldn't find work. He had always had a bad knee, a little limp from a childhood injury that never got fixed right. So sometimes he drank a little bit too much because it depressed him that he couldn't find enough work and he couldn't do that physical stuff that he used to do when he was younger. And I had to go to work. I worked cleaning the woman's house down the street. I hated to leave my children, but it was okay. And things were hard there for a few years until Will got this wonderful chance to run one of those little neighborhood grocery stores. And we got to live upstairs, and we all helped out in the store. And Will was so good at this, people would stop in that store, whether they needed to buy anything or not, just to talk to him and find out what was going on in the neighborhood. But then along came what they called the Depression. And Will couldn't bear not to keep writing out those little slips when people came in, wanted their groceries, and he knew they weren't going to have money to pay for it at the end of the week because they didn't have any jobs, and we lost the store. And that was a tough time. And a few years later, Will got sick. That leg was very bad. He got cancer, and he died, and World War II came along, and all my sons and my son-in-law were off in strange, foreign, dangerous places, and it was just women, girls, and little grandchildren at home, and that was not really an easy time either. And after the war, I went to live with my daughter and her husband because my daughter had to go back to work. She was a nurse. She had gone to school and gotten to be a nurse. But she needed help with her children. Her little boy was very sickly, and they needed extra money to pay for all the medicine he used. So I was in charge of those two little kids. And that little boy needed to be rocked and held and carried around almost all day long, and at night he was often up, and I would try to get up with him so that my daughter could get her sleep. And one day, I was going by this mirror that I'd passed 1,000 times, and I suddenly stopped and looked, and there was an old woman looking out at me. And she had a thin, worn face, and her eyes didn't have any sparkle in them, and her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. And I looked at her, and I thought, whatever happened to Ethelinda? I better find her again. I can't go on like this. Now, I knew I wouldn't find Ethelinda like when I first met Will. That only happens once in a lifetime. But I decided I better find her a little bit, even in little tiny moments. So I started. When my granddaughters would stop in after school to have a snack, I never used to stop. I would keep working and kind of talk to them. But now I would get out my china cup. I'd make a real cup of tea with real tea leaves in it, and I'd sit down and talk to them. And at the end of the tea in the cup, we would look at those tea leaves, and we would tell fortunes, and we would make up wild stories about winning lots of money or going on travels or them marrying into royalty, all kinds of fun things. And we would laugh. Another little thing I did was when I washed my hair and it was a nice sunny day, I would sit out in the backyard and let that bun out, that long hair that Will used to talk about, just kind of dry in the sun. And I would remember Will's voice talking to me. But the biggest and best thing I did was start a flower garden. I had been wanting to do that for years and never had time, but now I was going to do it. My daughter said, oh, that's too much work, but I said, oh, it's not work. I love doing this. And I took this little plot of land out by the sidewalk, and I turned that into a perennial garden. It was a lot of work, took a lot of time, but I got some seeds and some slips of plants from neighbors, and I saved money to buy some bushes, and before you know it, that garden had flowers every week of the year, the summer anyway, starting with little crocuses and daffodils and tulips and working up to when the lilacs came out and the flowering bushes and the big peonies and the sunflowers. And that garden got so pretty and so nice that people taking their walk after supper would stop and look at it. And if I was out in the yard, they'd ask me questions like, how do you get your roses to look so good? Or where'd you get those beautiful, large, especially large peony bushes? And I would talk to them and tell them well, and we would have little conversations. And one day a man went by and took a picture of my garden, and he came back a couple days later and he gave me some copies of the picture, and I could put that in the kitchen so that even on rainy days or snowy days, my garden was right with me. And I really felt like Ethelinda. And I really loved my garden. My garden's finished. There's not much more to do with it, just to kind of keep it going. I have been thinking of one last thing I'd like to add to it. I've been thinking of a sign to put on that white picket fence that's in front of right in front by the sidewalk. I think I'd make it an oval sign, painted white, and I'd get somebody who really knew how to do lettering to put it on there, and I'd have it say, Ethelinda's garden. Ethelinda. That's all one word, you know. Thank you.